Today we're talking about social and political systems. So, social organization are the rules and structures that govern relationships between individuals within a group of interacting people. So what does that actually mean? Well, there are different ways we can talk about that. Residential social organization, these are spatially defined social groups or the people who you tend to interact with on a regular basis through face-to-face interactions. So members of your own household or the town or village that you might live in, for example. There are also what we call non-residential social organizations, and these tend to be more abstract groups that are defined using a common set of symbols that represent political or ceremonial roles within a particular society. There are also what we call political organizations, and these are formal and informal institutions that regulate a society's collective acts. And so we tend to refer to these sometimes as egalitarian bands or maybe highly stratified chiefdoms. So because archaeologists use material remains to reconstruct past human behaviors, it's important to remember what we've talked about in the past. This concept of middle-level theory or middle-range theory. And through that, we understand that the archaeological record equals past behaviors as well as the formation processes that have acted on them, on those material remains. So in that case, there's both systemic and archaeological processes that could have influenced patterns that were left behind. It's important to remember then that material culture reflects the symbolic meanings and functional behaviors of past societies. So you can imagine there's different social connotations between, nowadays us bringing a bottle of wine to a dinner party or making an offering of wine at a shrine or altar within a past society, for example. There are four major components of human societies that we're able to try and access through the archaeological record, and we'll talk through some examples of each of these in the lecture today. The first being gender. So some terminology, first of all, is a person's sex. These are the inherited or biological differences between males and females, although nowadays there are 3 recognized human sexes, including male, female, and intersex. Gender refers to then the culturally constructed ideas about sex differences, and in this case there can be multiple genders. An example of this among Native American societies is the two-spirit tradition, or people who maybe would have been recognized as male at birth, but tend to identify more with the female gender and then express that more throughout their life. From this, we also have the term gender roles, and these are the differential participation of males and females in various aspects of society. And gender roles tend to describe the culturally appropriate behaviors for each gender. Now, this is something that archaeologists can hope to draw some interpretations of. When it comes to gender ideology, however, which are the culturally specific meaning and value assigned to terms related to sex and gender, this is very difficult to get at archaeologically. I mean, you really need to talk to someone to gain an understanding of their gender ideology, and gender ideologies can shift and fluctuate from situation to situation, so it's very hard to look at archaeologically. An example of this then from my iconography, or when we look at how women are depicted, we can recognize them by the way they're dressed or particular glyphs. And in the examples you're seeing here, if I can get my mouse, you see the woman here on the left, as well as the woman here in the bottom right corner, who's depicted as being a bit smaller than the male figure, which is assumed to be her husband in this case. So women are often seen as holding or offering objects to men, or perhaps preparing food within these scenes that are depicted. Now, archaeologist Rosemary Joyce looked at ethnographic data from the codices, from early Spanish observations, as well as conducting some modern ethnography to look for alternative interpretations of why women were depicted in these ways. What she came across is what's called the cargo system. And this is something that's was practiced by the ancient Maya and is still practiced today by many indigenous groups across Latin America. And within that system, a married man is selected annually to direct ceremonies and sponsors feasts with his wife's help. So, with that information, Joyce argued then that the women that are depicted in Maya art may actually have occupied similar complementary rather than subservient roles to their husbands. And so this is helping us to get at some potential gender roles, but again, nowhere close to the sorts of gender ideologies we might hope to capture. When we're talking about kinship, we mean the socially recognized network of relationships through which individuals are related to one another by ties of descent that are either real or imagined, as well as marriage. Now, the way we tend to do things here in the States is what we call bilateral descent, and this means that an individual traces their relatives equally through their mother's and their father's sides, and neither side is necessarily more important than the other. So this is why the nuclear family is the most important economic unit within American society. There are examples, however, of unilineal descent, which is when an individual traces their relatives through just one side of their family and not the other. And these are defined as patrilineal or matrilineal societies. In these cases, the nuclear family might not actually be the residential unit. Instead, the most important group is the actual lineage itself. So as I said, there are two examples of these types of societies that practice unilineal descent. In patrilineal societies, your descent is traced through the male line. So this means that you are related to your father and his siblings, your father's brother's children, and your father's father and his siblings. We recognize this in about 60% of known societies. And what you're seeing in the figure on the bottom left then are the triangles represent men, or males, and the circles represent the females. And so where these two lineages come together, we see that the child of this marriage is therefore belongs to the orange male's lineage because it's his son's child. We don't know the sex of the individual in this case. On the other hand, matrilineal societies, your descent is traced through the female line, so you're related to your mother, her siblings, and her sister's offspring, as well as your mother's mother, her siblings, and her sister's offspring. And we recognize this in about 10% of known societies. And so, therefore, in the example here, we're seeing this, this marriage in the middle. It's the female, the orange female in this case, that's determining the lineage or descent system for this child. So how we can look at this archaeologically, we talk about matrilocal or patrilocal residence patterns, and in this case we're seeing a patrilocal residence pattern, which means that the married couples live within the groom's home village. And so this map is showing us two patrilineages within a single hamlet that are connected through intermarriage in houses F, which we can see here, and house H, which we see here. So in those two cases, we're seeing that it's a son of the orange triangle who has married the daughter of a pink triangle. So two males, two patriarchs, in these cases. And we can tell that it's a patrilocal residence pattern because this woman, the daughter of the pink male, has gone to live from this smaller part of the hamlet into the male side, into the groom's side of the hamlet. And their children are also orange because their father is part of the orange lineage. Hope that makes sense. Archaeologically, we can get at this sort of information through differences in household size or the layout, as I showed here. There's also biodistance markers, so looking at the skeletons themselves to determine who's more or less related to one another, as well as genetics. DNA would definitely show us who and how people are related. Okay, the next topic then is social status, and by this we're talking about the rights, duties, privileges, and powers that accrue to a recognized and named social position. And this can be assigned through either ascription or achievement. So when we're talking about ascribed status, you can think of Prince Charles here, who is the son of Queen Elizabeth II, because his status as a royal was assigned to him at birth through his parentage. So he didn't necessarily have any innate differences or abilities that gave him that power. He's just given it because of who his mother is. In the second example, we have what's called achieved status. And in those cases, an individual comes to be seen as having admirable qualities or maybe accomplished certain tasks that deemed them to be important within their culture. So for example, a Shoshone man who proves himself to be a good hunter would have achieved some level of status, whether temporary or if they can maintain that for a longer period of time, depends on the society. How we talk about these sorts of differences within archaeology then are egalitarian or ranked societies as two ends of a spectrum. Within egalitarian societies, these are societies within which everyone's relatively equal in terms of status and in terms of the types of positions that they're able to fill, and everyone has relatively equal access to the critical resources they need to survive. Within ranked societies, on the other hand, we see this hierarchy of social status that's been established. There's only certain numbers of people that can occupy these sort of valued positions, and not all people, so all people do not have the same access to the critical resources they need to live. An example of this then from the site of Moundville, where we have a rather large sample, over 3,000 excavated burials that give us some unique insight into Mississippian social structure. We look at three types of data. We can get some interesting patterns. The first being the grave goods themselves. We see examples where there are high concentrations of grave goods within children's burials. This would signal that there's possibly a scribe status happening in this society, and that would help us to determine that their social organization was a bit more pyramidal, so only a few people at the top, lots more people at the bottom. When we conduct a faunal analysis at the site, we see that the elite had a wider range of choices of game when it comes to the types of meat that they were able to consume compared to commoner households. But bioarchaeologically, we actually see no significant differences between the elite and commoners in terms of their stature or life expectancy, or even any of the health factors that we're able to determine. Lastly, our trade systems, and what we attempt to do in these cases are establish the geographic scale over which trade would have occurred, and this helps us to get a better understanding of the political, economic, and kinship connections of a particular society with its neighbors. We tend to do this using exotics, are what we call them, so objects that are made of non-local raw materials or in a style that indicates they may have come from somewhere else. Two main ways that we interpret that humans in the past acquired these types of objects. The first being direct acquisition, which is when a person or a group goes to the source area directly to acquire the object or the raw material, versus down the line exchange or trade, which when we have a source area, say an obsidian source, we see that the farther out we move geographically from that source, there's this sort of standardized fall-off pattern that you would expect to see. So the farther you get away, the less access you have to it because things just kind of move progressively further out. Now, if we were to suddenly be mapping that on like an XY sort of plane, we might see a little blip, like a sudden raise or increase in the presence of that obsidian source, perhaps. And in that case, maybe some merchants acquired some large cores that allowed them to make a lot of blades within that particular merchant or trading center. So we would identify this then as a sort of secondary trading center, and that helps to kind of spread that source out a bit further than we would expect. There are a variety of sourcing methods that we can use to identify exotics. The first being actually fingerprinting the raw materials themselves based on chemical or elemental analyses. This applies to obsidian, clay, turquoise, other stones, or metals. And we use these acronyms stand for X-ray fluorescence, instrumental neutron activation analysis, or a scanning electron microprobe. These are different ways of determining the chemical composition of materials, and we can relate that to the geology of a region to figure out where things might have been coming from. We're also able to look at the macro and microscopic attributes of artifacts, so pottery, shell, or figurines, for example. And that can help us to determine how a pot was made, for example, and that's a way you're only able to learn that in a workshop sort of setting and as an apprentice from someone who you interact with directly. This is the type of work that I'm focusing on right now, so if you'd like to know more about it, then let me know.